Stan Grant, Sydney, Australia, 18 June 2020.
Hello, Stan Grant. Good morning, because it is 10 a.m. in Australia, 2 p.m. in Paris. So how are you feeling, and what are you feeling towards all we've been living those last months?
I'm feeling well. I'm feeling grateful that Australia was not as deeply affected as so many other parts of the world, particularly where you're sitting right now. You know, we've looked at the impact that coronavirus has had and the devastating impact, and the number of people who were affected, the number of people who have died. And we're very lucky in Australia, I think, that we are quite isolated from the world. We don't share a land border with another country, so it's quite easy to be able to seal our country off. We're a big country with a small population, and that makes it much more manageable. There are cities in the world, cities that I've lived in, places like Beijing, for instance, which have a population that is the same as the entire population of Australia. So being isolated, being a small population with lots of space in a big country, being a country, thankfully, that is a wealthy country and could support people through this process has made things a lot easier. And it still takes a toll, you know, that sense of being detached, of being separated from other people. We were still having, you know, a lockdown here where we had to stay inside. But I used it as well to focus on some things that are important, you know, to think about things, to read a lot, to write a lot. So I tried to turn that into a productive time as well.
Now, your love of books is very present since your childhood. Why are they so important to you? How are they seen? How is literature seen in Australia? And why were books so important for you during these times of anxiety?
Books are my home, really. Books and music have been a permanent home for me, and in some ways, the only home I have had. I've moved around so much. My family were a very poor family, which is very common amongst Indigenous people in Australia. Poor for much of my childhood, essentially a homeless family. We moved from one place to another, often sleeping in our cars or by the side of the road. So I didn't have a consistent education. It wasn't until I was probably 14 or 15 that we spent any significant time in one place, and I could start school and finish school in the same place for the same year. Up until then, it had been a very sporadic education. I changed schools maybe more than 15 or 16 times. So I didn't have any continuity to my education. But the one thing I did have was just a voracious appetite for knowledge and books. From as young as I could remember, I was fascinated by stories. I come from a really deep storytelling tradition. In my family, we are storytellers in a traditional sense, in an Aboriginal sense. And we pass down our history and our family relationships through stories. So I was getting an education, a very deep cultural education from my parents, who would tell me stories about our family. And that shaped my own love of storytelling. And then whenever my mother would see any books for sale, any secondhand bookstores, or if we were living in a town and I could go to a library, I would read everything. I think not going to school a lot at a young age meant that I could embrace things in a way that I wouldn't necessarily at school. So from a very young age, I was reading things that perhaps I didn't even fully understand at the time, but 7 or 8 years old, I would be reading Hemingway. You know, I would be reading Steinbeck. I just discovered James Baldwin at a very young age, and the world that he opened up to me, a world of Black America, which sounded like my own world. It was only because I was encountering these books in a freestyle way, just finding them and reading them, sitting with them and allowing them to wash over me, that it just gave me such an appreciation of the power of words and the power of storytelling, and how in those words we can find each other. Gave me a world beyond my own.
Now, you say that journalism saved you. You lived in a lot of countries. Why did you choose to become a witness of the world?
It was probably an accident of fate more than anything else. It just seemed to happen. You know, the earliest memories that I have are memories of watching momentous events on television or listening to it on the radio. The Vietnam War. I was only 5 or 6 years old, but I vividly remember seeing those images. The moon landing. I remember sitting as a young boy and watching that unfold. This momentous time in our history really had a big impact on me. My love of words, my love of stories, it felt like a natural home for me. And it opened up for me in ways that I could never have planned or anticipated. At critical times of my life, I met people who would open doors for me, who would give me opportunities and supported me, particularly other Aboriginal people who supported me to be able to chase those dreams. And when I found myself in journalism after university, I was probably only 20, 21 years old, but it immediately felt like a place that was very familiar. To go and observe, to witness, to write, to speak, to encounter other people, the curiosity of wanting to know about the world, the curiosity of wanting to know the stories of other people, and my own story, the world that I saw through my own eyes because of my history. It made perfect sense to me, and it felt entirely natural.
Now, when you worked for CNN, you lived in Hong Kong and Peking, where the coronavirus is striking back. What's your view on the way that China treated and dealt with this virus?
I was there, of course, during the SARS outbreak as well. So I'd had an experience of living through a pandemic. And there were so many things that overlapped. You know, when you were talking about an authoritarian regime, control is everything. Control of power, control of information, control of people. The initial response of the Chinese Communist Party was the response that you would expect. It is to shut down, it is to stop information, it is to silence those people who want to speak. So the whistleblowers, the doctors, the people who wanted to alert the world to this were often shut away. We know that, you know, and we know that one of the doctors who had been one of the first whistleblowers ultimately died from coronavirus himself. This is entirely consistent with that type of authoritarian regime. At the same time, the ability of a country to mobilize itself, to lock down, to be able to impose the restrictions on people without question, meant that they could break the back of the virus very quickly. They could get to the other side very quickly. And while they're still dealing with sporadic outbreaks, to essentially contain that crisis and to defeat the spread of that virus, I think showed us the duality of authoritarian regimes, that they are capable of dealing with crisis in a way that perhaps democracies struggle, while at the same time they are built on secrecy and centralized power that can exacerbate those problems. So it's the challenge of our age. I don't think there is any more significant challenge in the world than how the world incorporates or deals with the rise of a superpower that will soon be the most powerful economy in the world, that does not live by what we've seen as a global liberal democratic order, that is unashamedly an authoritarian regime. And I think coronavirus has only accelerated that clash, that confrontation that was inevitable between liberal democracy, what we call this liberal order, for its faults as well, and this rising authoritarian power at a time when democracy in many countries is under siege. So I think coronavirus really focuses our attention on that and accelerates the questions around how we. It was a deep moment in history for all of us.
Stan, I lost you. Stan, are you there?
Yes, are you? Yes, yes, I am.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
another important news was the death of George Floyd and this movement called Black Lives Matter. Now, your book, called in French Sourd de colère, un aborigène indigné, that was published by Le Vent des Îles, treats about this matter because you write that being Black or being Aboriginal is intensively politic. Why? And why does this story give an echo to your own story and to your suffering?
When we hear the cries of George Floyd in that video, we know where that comes from. When we see a policeman with his knee on the neck of a Black man in America, we know what that looks like. The echo of that struggle is felt here because our lives have been shaped by the same forces, whether it be First Nations people in America, Native American people, whether it be African American people with the history of slavery, or whether it be Indigenous people in Australia with a history of invasion and colonisation and genocide. It comes from the same source. It comes from an idea that because of who you are, because of how you are seen, because of how other people define you, you can be stripped of your humanity. You know, the idea of Blackness, the idea of otherness, is a reflection of what has often been called, you know, the white gaze. This whiteness that is normalized, this whiteness that is centralized, this whiteness that came in empire and colonization, that took people's land, put people in chains, massacred people, locked people out of society, and defined us in a way that stripped us of our humanity. So the shared struggle, I think, of people all around the world to confront the legacy of this history is what I was really writing into. This was a story that was intensely personal for me. It was a reflection of the struggles in my country, a reflection of the history of my family. But we know that the struggle for justice and equality and the struggle against racism is a struggle without borders. It is something that speaks to all of us who know what it is to be seen through the white gaze. And it's also an attempt to speak to that whiteness, to say to people who, perhaps for all of their goodwill, just cannot know what it is to experience what we have experienced. And then to those people who will refuse to believe it, who will deny that legacy, or will tell us that we can just move on, we can just get over it, that we should put that history behind us. This was an attempt to say that this history lives in us. It is there, we can touch it, we can see it, we can smell it, we know it. And unfortunately, it's a legacy of history that still kills people today.
Now, this book came out of anger, of rage, because of the burden of history, as you're saying, because of the exclusion and the misery. As you write that Aboriginal people see the Australian dream as a nightmare. Why is this nightmare still hidden, still taboo in your country?
Australia is a paradox. It is, to the outside world, a picture postcard. You know, it has endless sunshine and beautiful beaches, and it is a beacon of freedom and democracy for so many people. It has been a haven for so many people, people who have risked everything in their own lives to make it here, to find a new life. And Australia, on one level, and a very deep level, is an extraordinary experiment of tolerance and multiculturalism and peace and cohesion. That is true. That is undoubtedly true. We don't have the deep conflicts of history in other lands here. In fact, it's a place where many people come to escape history, where Shia does not have to be at war with Sunni, where, you know, Pakistani and Indian can meet each other without conflict, where the blood feuds of history are set aside, except for us, because what happened in this land happened to us. Our history is not in another place. We can't escape our history. We can't put our history behind us. And I think when people see Australia, or when Australians speak or write about their country, they can't see past the glory of Australia, the greatness of Australia, and they can't imagine what it is to live our lives. We are so few, we are fewer than 3% of the Australian population. So many of our people were simply wiped out in the first decades after European invasion and colonisation. Disease and violence eradicated enormous populations. And what we are left with today are people like myself who are the survivors of that frontier, who often are never seen, who most Australians have never met. So to open Australia's eyes to this history means Australians have to look to themselves and challenge the very idea they have of their own country. And for the rest of the world, of course, we're out of sight and out of mind. It's called in Australia, you know, amongst ourselves, amongst Aboriginal people, we call it the torment of powerlessness. The torment of powerlessness. How do you speak back to power that will not see you and will not hear you?
Now, another thing is your own identity. Would you say that through writing this book in this big Australian silence, as you name it, is it also a way of connecting back to your own identity and give a voice to the Indigenous people to tell them we exist, we can write, we can live, we can be ourselves?
You know, I think that's the wonderful thing about writing, is that we come alive in those words, that we can breathe onto that page our existence, and we can speak that truth to whatever world wants to hear it. You know, when I sit down to write, I feel free, I feel liberated, I feel as if I can be honest, that I can put onto that page what I feel, what I know to be true. And I don't care what other people think, what other people may say. It is enough to exist. It is enough to say, this is true. So identity for me arises out of that act of becoming, of being, of saying, I am here. This is my story. That story is the way of identifying me. But I also know identity can be accurate. Identity itself imprisons us in the idea or in the ideas of what blackness is. Yes?
I'm sorry, I lost
you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I
Can
hear
you hear me?
Now I do.
Yep.
That identity, what?
Yes. But I also know that identity can be a straitjacket. Identity itself can be a prison when we allow other people to define what we are, when we even allow other people to define blackness. You know, James Baldwin once wrote that he went to Paris because he did not want to be a Negro, let alone a Negro writer, in his words. It didn't mean that he didn't want to be black. It meant that he would not be anyone's idea of what blackness should be. The idea of writing for me is to write myself free, to be what I want to be in the world, with all of its contradictions and all of its messiness and all of that history, but to live in that world where I'm not chained to other people's definitions of who I am, and I am not chained to that history. Writing is freedom.
Now, you name yourself as a survivor of a big story, of history. During those times of coronavirus, we've been speaking a lot of death and of health, of sickness. How is life and death seen in your own culture?
That's a really good question. That is a really good question, because one of the things that I was saying to people when the coronavirus hit is that white people have a fear of death. They have this idea of immortality. It's almost as like they should not and will not die. White people love monuments to themselves. They love statues. They love architecture that speaks to some idea of permanence. And of course, in their own lives, they cling to their life as if this is something that dare not be taken from them. And I wonder sometimes about how that is a manifestation of that power, that power that whiteness gives you. I will not be moved. And yet for us, the life and death cycle is entirely normal. I have no fear of death because I know where I am going. I know that there is a place in the world for me. There is a place where I will be buried. I will be laid to rest. And it is my place. It is my country. It is my land. It is where my ancestors are. So the life and death cycle is entirely normal. I didn't have the fear of coronavirus for what it would do to me. I lived my life knowing who I am, and I'm fully prepared to die. I feared more for what it would do to our society and other people, but I didn't fear for myself. And I think one of the things to come out of this is that for the people who do not have the tradition that I come from, who do not have that understanding, the spiritual life that embraces our life and our death, then I think they're going to have to look again at the idea of permanence and the idea of whiteness and the idea of power. Because a virus like this doesn't respect power. It doesn't respect whiteness. It doesn't respect borders. It doesn't respect your statues and your monuments and the legacy of your history. This tells us that we are absolutely human and that we must have an idea of our place in the world as human beings. I think it challenges us all to look at how we see death and how we view this idea of our permanence and our immortality.
Now, in your book, you quote the playwright Eugene O'Neill saying that there is no present, there is no future, only a past that repeats itself continuously. You also say that there is a gap between your son as you because there is this Australian dream still going on. What do you think about the future for him, for his generation? Do you think that everything is still possible?
I struggle with this idea of possibility and hope, because on the one hand, we need that to get up each day. How do we go on? How do we survive if we don't believe in possibility, if we don't believe in hope? And if I look at my father and my mother and my grandparents, my life materially is so much better than what they had to endure. And through our struggle for rights, for civil rights, for human rights, our struggle for equality and justice, we have torn down so many of the barriers between us. We have demanded that we be treated as human beings. And that has come from our struggle. And the struggle gives me the hope of a better day. It is that struggle that I believe in. But I also know that for someone like myself who has managed to create a world and an opportunity and a life for himself that was unimaginable when I was a boy, that there are so many other Indigenous people, Aboriginal people in Australia, for whom that is not possible. And it is not because they don't believe in hope. It is not because they don't work hard. It is not because they lack anything. It is because there are deep structural problems in our country that keep people in chains. That means that we are still, 200 years after Europeans came here, we are still the most impoverished and the most imprisoned people in this country. That does not give me cause for hope. That just tells me that the struggle endures. And for my son, I named my youngest son Jesse Martin Justice Grant. Jesse Jackson, Martin Luther King Jr., and justice for all. He is born into a struggle, and I want him to know that it is the struggle that we have to keep up, not the belief in hope or the belief in possibility, but the belief that it is through struggle that we give life to hope.
Thank you so much for this beautiful message, San Grant, and please take care.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much. Really good to talk to you, and please, my best wishes and deepest thoughts to all of the people where you are as you continue to try to come out of this horrible time. It's been a terrible time for you, and my thoughts are with you all.
And thank you. My thoughts are also with you and with you people, and we'll need to have a new future. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.